In the summer of 1967, a road crew working on Highway 7 through the Arkansas Ozarks made a discovery that would haunt them for decades. Buried beneath 6 feet of mountain clay, they found a wooden box containing 23 letters, a faded photograph, and a birth certificate that told an impossible story. The birth certificate bore 2 names in the father's section, one crossed out, one written in shaking handwriting above it. The photograph showed a young woman holding an infant, her eyes hollow with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite madness. The letters told the rest. The state buried the find. The workers were paid to forget. The highway was rooted, but the story survived, passed down in whispers through the hollers and ridges of Newton County, becoming the kind of tale that old-timers would only tell after the 3rd drink, when the fire burned low and the children were asleep. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you are watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What I'm about to tell you isn't just folklore. It's documented history that powerful people have spent over 50 years trying to erase. The woman at the center of this story was named Opal Mae Hendricks, though by the end she had so many names that even she seemed to forget which one was real. Born in 1932 in the remote hills of Arkansas, Opal became the unwilling protagonist of a family curse that would span 3 generations and challenge everything we think we know about the darkness that confessed her in isolated communities. The Hendricks family had lived in the same hollow for over a century, their bloodline growing thinner and stranger with each passing decade. By the time Opal was born, the family tree looked more like a twisted valley and its branches reaching back on themselves in ways that defied both nature and decency. But what happened to Opal Mae Hendricks went beyond even the darkest whispers of mountain folk. Her story is one of manipulation, psychological torture, and a pregnancy that would produce a child whose very existence was an affront to nature itself. The Hendricks Hollow sat like a wound in the Arkansas mountains, a place where the sun seemed reluctant to shine, and the mist never quite lifted, even in the heat of summer. Local maps from the 1930s show the area as blank space, though postal records confirm that mail was delivered there twice a month by a carrier who was paid double wages and never stayed longer than necessary. The few outsiders who ventured into the hollow described it as a place where time moved differently, where the very air seemed thick with secrets and unspoken shame. Jeremiah Hendricks ruled this isolated kingdom with the iron fist of a man who believed himself beyond the reach of both God and government. Born in 1895, he had inherited not just the land, but a twisted philosophy that saw his family as chosen, separate from the corruption of the outside world. To Jeremiah, the hollow was Eden, and he was its only patriarch. His wife Sarah Mae had died in childbirth in 1920, leaving him to raise 3 daughters and 2 sons according to his own warped vision of righteousness. By the time Opal was born in 1932, she was already living in a world that operated by rules no civilized society would recognize. Jeremiah had long since decided that his bloodline was too pure to be contaminated by outsiders. The other children had already learned to accept arrangements that would horrify anyone beyond the ridgeline. But Opal was different. Even as a child, she possessed a spirit that seemed to recognize the wrongness of her world. A light that Jeremiah would spend the next 20 years systematically trying to extinguish. The isolation was total. No telephone lines reached the hollow. No newspapers, no radio signals penetrated the mountain walls. The children were educated by Jeremiah himself from a collection of religious texts and medical books that seemed to justify every twisted practice he imposed upon his family. To the outside world, the Hendricks family simply didn't exist. And in that non-existence, horrors flourished like poisonous flowers in perpetual darkness. As Opal grew from child to teenager, Jeremiah began implementing what he called her education and family duty. The letters found in 1967 reveal a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that modern experts would recognize as textbook grooming, but with a theological twist that made it uniquely sinister. Jeremiah convinced Opal that she had been chosen by divine providence for a special purpose, that her beauty and intelligence were gifts meant to preserve the purity of their bloodline. The manipulation began when Opal turned 14. Jeremiah started requiring private scripture sessions where he would read her passages from books that no legitimate church would recognize. These texts, apparently written by Jeremiah himself, spoke of sacred bloodlines, of chosen families who must remain untainted by the corruption of outsiders. He told Opal that their family carried the blood of biblical patriarchs, that mixing with strangers would dilute a divine gift that had been preserved for centuries. But the most insidious part of Jeremiah's campaign was how he twisted Opal's natural rebellion against him. Every time she questioned his teachings, every moment she showed defiance, he reframed as proof of her special calling. He told her that her resistance was natural, that it showed she understood the magnitude of her destiny. He convinced her that her very reluctance was what made her worthy. That willing compliance would somehow taint the sacred act he was preparing her for. By 1948, when Opal was 16, Jeremiah had completely isolated her from her siblings. He moved her to a separate cabin he had built deeper in the hollow, telling the others that she needed solitude to prepare for her calling. But isolation was just another weapon in his arsenal. Cut off from any other human contact, Opal began to depend entirely on Jeremiah for companionship, for validation, for her very understanding of reality. In those letters, she would later describe feeling as though she were living in a dream, unable to distinguish between Jeremiah's twisted theology and her own thoughts. The final phase of her grooming came disguised as preparation for motherhood. Jeremiah began teaching her about sacred conception, about women in the Bible who had borne children through divine intervention. He told her that God had appeared to him in visions, commanding him to ensure the continuation of their holy bloodline, and Opal, broken down by years of isolation and manipulation, began to believe him. What happened next is documented in Opal's own handwriting and letters she would later hide throughout the hollow like breadcrumbs, marking a trail of trauma. The first letter, dated March 15, 1950, begins with the words, "Today Papa told me that the Lord had chosen me to bear his grandson." The innocent way she wrote those words, the complete absence of horror in her tone, reveals just how thoroughly Jeremiah had warped her understanding of right and wrong. The sacred ceremony took place on Opal's 18th birthday. Jeremiah had spent months preparing her, convincing her that what was about to happen was not only natural, but holy. He had created an elaborate ritual around the act, complete with homemade religious vestments and prayers that twisted biblical language into something unrecognizable. To Opal, brainwashed and isolated for years, this felt like a religious experience rather than the horrific violation it truly was. But Jeremiah's control extended beyond psychological manipulation. The medical books in his collection weren't random. They were obstetric manuals, guides to midwifery, texts on heredity and bloodlines. He had been studying, preparing for this moment with the cold calculation of a man who saw human beings as breeding stock. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly how to frame it so that Opal would cooperate willingly. The conception that followed wasn't a single incident, but a systematic campaign that lasted months. Jeremiah had convinced Opal that divine conception might require multiple attempts, that her body needed to be properly prepared to receive what he called the sacred seed. Each violation was framed as a religious ritual, each pregnancy scare as a test of faith. When Opal finally conceived in late 1950, Jeremiah declared it a miracle, proof that God had blessed their union. But even as Opal's body began to change, her mind started to fracture. The letters from this period show a woman struggling between the reality of her situation and the elaborate fiction Jeremiah had constructed around it. She wrote about dreams where she was someone else living in towns beyond the mountains, married to men whose faces she couldn't quite remember. She described feeling as though she were watching her life happen to another person, as if the Opal who was carrying her father's child was just a character in someone else's nightmare. If you're still watching, you are already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The child that Opal Mae Hendricks carried through the winter of 1950 was born on June 21, 1951 during what old-timers still call the longest storm in Arkansas history. For 3 days, lightning split the sky above the hollow, while Opal lay barred in a cabin that had become her prison. Jeremiah served as midwife, using skills he had learned from books that seemed to anticipate this very moment. No doctor was called. No official record was made. The birth certificate found in 1967 would be written weeks later in Jeremiah's careful handwriting. The infant that emerged from this unholy union was by all accounts physically perfect. A son, as Jeremiah had predicted, with the distinctive Hendricks features, pale eyes, sharp cheekbones, and an unsettling intelligence that seemed to manifest even in infancy. But Opal's letters from the weeks following the birth reveal something deeply wrong with the child's development. She wrote about how he never cried, never seemed to sleep, how his eyes would track movement with an awareness that felt unnatural in something so young. Jeremiah named the boy Cain after the biblical firstborn, though he would tell anyone who asked that the name was purely coincidental, but there was nothing coincidental about how he treated the child. From the moment of birth, Jeremiah began grooming his grandson with the same calculated manipulation he had used on Opal. He spoke to the infant as if it could understand complex theological concepts, reading from his homemade scriptures while the child stared with those pale knowing eyes. Opal, meanwhile, was descending into what modern psychology would recognize as severe postpartum psychosis compounded by years of trauma and the impossible reality of her situation. Her letters describe hallucinations where the child would speak to her in Jeremiah's voice, visions where she would see her own face reflected in the infant's features. She began to refer to herself in the third person as if Opal Mae Hendricks was someone she had once known but could no longer access. The most disturbing entry in her correspondence comes from August 1951, 2 months after the birth. She wrote, "The baby looks at me like he knows what Papa did, like he knows what I let Papa do. Sometimes I think he's not my son at all, but Papa made small again come back to punish me for enjoying it." The last 3 words of that sentence, "for enjoying it," reveal the final devastating layer of Jeremiah's manipulation. He had convinced Opal that her body's natural responses during the assaults were evidence of her willing participation, that her trauma was actually pleasure, that her victimization was really sin. By the spring of 1952, the Hollow had become a stage for a drama that defied human comprehension. Opal's remaining siblings had begun to whisper among themselves about what they had witnessed, about the sounds that came from the deep cabin at night, about the way their father looked at the child with an expression that mixed pride and hunger in equal measure. But none of them dared to challenge Jeremiah directly. Fear had become the family's second religion. The breaking point came on Easter Sunday 1952. Opal's letters describe a family gathering where Jeremiah presented young Cain to the other children, proclaiming him the future patriarch of their bloodline. As he spoke, holding the infant high like some twisted nativity scene, Opal finally understood the true scope of his plan. This wasn't just about one unholy union. Jeremiah intended to create an entire dynasty built on these abominations, with Cain as the cornerstone of a new generation that would keep the bloodline pure through methods that made Opal's own trauma seem like merely the opening act. That night, Opal began planning her escape. But leaving the Hollow wasn't just a matter of walking away. Jeremiah had spent decades ensuring that his children were psychologically and practically dependent on him. They had no identification, no understanding of the outside world, no skills beyond what he had taught them. More importantly, Opal had been so thoroughly broken that she genuinely believed she deserved her fate, that she was somehow complicit in her own destruction. Her escape attempt came in May 1952 during one of Jeremiah's rare trips to town for supplies. She bundled up Cain and began walking toward what she hoped was civilization, following a creek that she believed would lead her to the main road. But after 2 days of wandering through the mountains with a sick infant, she was found by her brother thieves who had been sent to track her down. The punishment that followed would be documented in Opal's most harrowing letter, written months later when her hands had finally healed enough to hold a pen. Jeremiah didn't just beat her. That would have been too simple. Instead, he began a campaign of psychological torture designed to ensure she would never attempt escape again. He convinced her that the outside world would immediately recognize Cain's unnatural origins, that authorities would take the child away and lock her in an asylum. He told her that she had already committed the ultimate sin, that running away would only compound her damnation. Most devastatingly, he convinced her that Cain needed her, that abandoning him would be the cruelest act of all. By the time he was finished, Opal believed that staying in the Hollow was not just her punishment, but her responsibility. The last letters Opal Mae Hendricks wrote were discovered not in the buried box, but carved into the walls of the deep cabin itself, found when demolition crews finally razed the structure in 1985. Written with what appears to be a nail or piece of broken glass, these final messages reveal a woman who had transcended madness and arrived at a terrible clarity about her situation and its implications for future generations. Cain is 3 years old now, one carving reads. And he has Papa's eyes when he looks at me. Today he asked why I sleep in Papa's room and he sleeps alone. I don't know how to answer because I don't remember choosing this. I think I used to be someone else before Papa made me into what I am now. Sometimes I see her in mirrors, the girl I used to be, and she looks so sorry for what I became. The final entry, carved deeper than the others, tells the story of Opal's last desperate act of defiance. In the winter of 1954, when Cain was nearly 4 years old, Jeremiah began speaking of expanding the bloodline, of finding Cain, a sister wife who could continue what Opal had started. The target he had chosen was Cain's 8-year-old cousin, Mary, daughter of Opal's brother, Thomas. But this time, Opal refused to remain passive. On February the 14th, 1955, a date chosen with deliberate irony, Opal Mae Hendricks walked into the main cabin where Jeremiah was sleeping and ended his reign of terror with a hunting knife she had hidden for months. Her final carved message describes the act with a cold precision that suggests she had planned every detail. I put the blade between his ribs while he was dreaming about Mary. He woke up just long enough to see what I had done. His last words were, "You can't save them all." He was right. What happened to Opal and young Cain after that night remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Arkansas folklore. They simply vanished, from the hollow, leaving behind only those carved messages and the buried box of letters that wouldn't be discovered for another 12 years. Some say they fled to distant cities where they could disappear into anonymity. Others believe they died in the mountains, consumed by the same wilderness that had hidden their suffering for so long. But the most persistent legend claims that Opal Mae Hendricks is still out there somewhere, an old woman now, carrying the weight of secrets that would destroy anyone who heard them. They say she wanders from town to town, appearing wherever families begin to show the signs of the same sickness that consumed the Hendricks Hollow. A guardian angel for the damned, warning others before they fall too far into darkness to ever find their way back. The truth about Opal Mae Hendricks may never be fully known, but her story serves as a reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, that isolation can become a weapon more powerful than any physical force, and that sometimes the only way to break a curse is to become something just as terrible as the thing you're fighting. In the end, she gave birth to her father's grandson. But she also gave birth to her own salvation, written in blood on the walls of her prison, and buried in letters that would outlive everyone who tried to silence her. The hollow where it all happened is still there, though the state has quietly bought up all the surrounding land and posted it as a nature preserve. No camping is allowed. No hiking trails lead there. But on certain nights when the mist rolls heavy through the mountains, locals say you can still hear the sound of a woman crying and the higher, thinner wail of a child calling for his mother or his sister in a voice that carries all the sadness of bloodlines that should never have.